Every so often in the Bible, we come across a person whose personality and story captures our imagination. And they sort of stand out above all others in the Bible. People like Jael and Judith. Have you heard of them? If you haven't, look them up. They're two people that you may not want to sort of double cross, but nonetheless, their stories are captivating ones. There's Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, David and Goliath, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And of course, there is that person who was in our reading this morning, John the Baptist. I don't know about you, but I find John to be an utterly captivating person. He lives on the edge of the desert, seemingly appearing out of nowhere, dressed up like an op shop sale. He has a voice that shatters both the desert quiet and the hearts of the lukewarm, revealing a charisma that the religious leaders of Jerusalem, in all their finery and finesse, would die for. He takes no prisoners, although in the end he becomes one, cast deep in the cells of Herod because he dares to speak truth to power. But even from there, even from that dark, dank dungeon, his voice can't be stifled. And Herod and Herodias, the cause of John's indignation and incarceration, get no peace. Until one night, Salome, Herodias' daughter, dances until nothing, not even imagination, is left for the lascivious Herod to drool over. And her reward? John's head on a platter. A reminder that Herods of whatever era and nationality are not to be trusted. And so John dies a martyr's death at the hands of Herod Antipas. Interestingly, the text for today from John's Gospel that we read before tells us more about who John wasn't than about who he was. And we heard that as we listened to the reading. He wasn't the light. He wasn't the Messiah. He wasn't Elijah. He wasn't the prophet. Who then was he? Well, John, the Gospel writer, says he was a witness. He was a voice, telling people to prepare for someone else, someone whose sandal thong John was unworthy to untie. Now, we don't tend to be great sandal wearers necessarily, except maybe at the beach or on a really hot summer's day. But the idea behind not being worthy to untie the thong of a sandal is really that John was saying, I am not worthy to untie Jesus' shoelaces. And so, in a sense, a servant or a slave would be the one who would do that for the master. And John is saying, I'm not even worthy to be a slave in the presence of this one who is to come. So John, in that sense, is a voice, and he is a witness. But in John's Gospel, for the most part, what John the Baptist does is that he points to Jesus. Now, I know that we were told never to point at people, but the reality is that John the Baptist is always pointing to Jesus. And that pointing people to Jesus is really important. You see, John the Baptist is a witness. John the Baptist testifies to the good news of Jesus Christ. And it's basically the same word. Witness and testifying are basically the same word almost in Greek. One's a noun and one's a verb, I get that. But the word is martyria, that is, that person is the witness, and martyreo, which is the testifying. Those two words appear more than 45 times in John's Gospel. It is a significant theme in John's Gospel, pointing to Jesus. And to be a witness is to publicly guarantee that what you say is true. When a witness testifies to something, he or she sort of, in a sense, stakes his or her life on what they are saying. That is what a witness does. And that's where we get the word martyr from. Now, some of you might recall a number of years ago, we had the pictures of and stories of 5 20th century martyrs on the walls of the church out in the courtyard there. Some of you might remember that. But these 5 martyrs that I had out on the walls were part of a group of 10 martyrs who are remembered in a carving above the west door of Westminster Abbey in London. And earlier this year, I was going to put the other 5 up for Lent. But COVID hit. And so they never got used until today. And so what I have here is the 5 boards of 5 martyrs. Her name is Esther John. Has anybody ever heard of Esther John? Roz has, Doug has, 1 or 2 maybe. All right. She lived from 1929 to 1960. She said, this is her little quote, which on each of the boards has, "Leave all other ties, Jesus is calling." And her story is this, that she was born Qamar Zia into an Islamic family. She attended a Christian school from the age of 17 and was so inspired by the book of Isaiah that she decided to become a Christian. And her Christian faith grew privately, even secretly. Then, fearful of the prospect of marriage to a Muslim husband, she ran away from her home. Her family still pressed her to return and to marry. And so in 1955, she moved to the Punjab and lived and worked in a mission hospital. She then taught in the villages, teaching women to read and working with them in the cotton fields. At times, her relationship with her distant and perplexed family appeared calmer. At other times, it was anxious and tension brewed. Her death was sudden and mysterious. On the 2nd of February 1960, Esther John was found dead in her bed at the house where she lived at Chichawatney. She had been brutally murdered. That is Esther John. This is a man called JANANI LUWUM. Anybody heard of JANANI LUWUM? One? Right. He says, his quote is, "I am prepared to die in the army of Jesus." He became a Christian in 1948, had a reputation for creative and active leadership, promoting a new vision with energy and commitment. But in 1971, Idi Amin, and there'll be a few who have heard of Idi Amin, came to power in Uganda. By this time, and Idi Amin was a terrible person. He ruled with intimidation, violence, and corruption. LUWUM, by this point, was the Archbishop of Uganda, and he was pushing ahead with church reforms. He sought to sort of mitigate, that it means to sort of, he sought to sort of soften, if you like, the effects of Amin's rule and to plead for the victims of that regime. And in 1977, he protested to Amin about the violence that the security services were inflicting on the people of Uganda. And church leaders were summoned to Kampala, the capital, and one by one they were ordered to leave, and LUWUM was the last one. And he confided to a colleague before the last colleague left, saying, "I'm not afraid, but they are going to kill me." And finally, alone, he was taken away and murdered. This one here, I find to be a very interesting and strange one. Has anybody ever heard of the Grand Duchess Elizabeth? She was a Russian princess or duchess, part of the royal family of the the Revolution. And what she did, and I'll paraphrase this one a bit, is that here was a person born into opulent wealth, into wealth that most of us would never know anything about. And she sort of gave it up. She sold all her very best possessions, and she started a home for women and a hospital and did charitable works. And her quote is really quite wonderful. She says, "I am leaving a glittering world where I had a glittering position, but with all of you I am descending into a greater world, the world of the poor and the suffering." And so she went into a convent, part of that there, and when the Russian Revolution came about, eventually she was killed along with a fellow nun in a mine shaft a day after the royal family had been killed. That's Grand Duchess Elizabeth, not the sort of person you might think would be on that thing. This is MANCHE MASEMOLA. She died when she was 15. She lived in South Africa in a small village, and the sort of traditional tribal religion was practiced by her family and her people in that tribe. She attended baptismal classes against the wishes of her parents, and the parents believed that she had been bewitched, and they tried to, put traditional remedies and things into her. The relationships worsened, and the mother hid the girl's clothes so she couldn't attend the baptismal classes. And then on February the 4th, 1928, her parents led her to a lonely place where they killed her and buried her by a granite rock. 15 years old. And she died without ever having been baptized. That's MANCHE MASEMOLA. The last one is the closest one to home. Lucian Tapiadi, man from Papua New Guinea. His father was a sorcerer, and who died when Lucian was quite young, and so he was brought up and taught in a Christian school and mission. And what happened was that when the Japanese invaded in the Second World War in 1942, he stuck with the missionaries, because anyone who were missionaries, probably most of them would have come from countries like Australia, New Zealand, those sorts of places. They were in serious trouble when the Japanese attacked PNG. He stayed with them. And they came to a village where they were escorted away by the men of that tribe, and one of them, the men of another tribe, killed Tapiadi in that sort of way. And so, and I suppose in a sense, the almost wonderful part of that story is that the man who killed him later on became a Christian. It says that 333 Christians lost their lives in Papua New Guinea during the World War II invasion and occupation by the Japanese forces, in that sense. So these are 5 people, the other 5. They're less known than the first 5 we had, but nonetheless, these are people that are witnesses, if you like. We use the word martyrs because they are, in that sense, technically martyrs who have given their life in witnessing and pointing to Jesus. As I thought about these people, they seem, don't they, so far removed from our experience. But listen and see if you can hear yourself. Because in these people, we hear the simple acts of witnessing. Witnessing to government and those in power. Witnessing to the most marginalised. Witnessing to your family. Witnessing to your neighbours. Witnessing among the poor and suffering. And the qualities that these 5 showed, well, they're not as removed from us or our experience as we might think. Humility, caring for the poor, loving your neighbour as yourself, visiting the sick, acts of kindness, giving generously to those in need. You see, in all these things, they pointed to Jesus. And they are not things that are beyond any of us. As Mark Allen Powell notes, these qualities are in tension with the spirit of our age. Most people today regard religion as a private matter and do not want to hear about someone else's particular beliefs. Certainty is also shunned in these postmodern times. We are all victims of our own perspectives. Who can ever know for sure whether anything is true or not? And that's the world that we live in. But he says, still we as Christians are audacious enough to believe that the gospel is true and that it must be proclaimed boldly, publicly, and confidently. And then come the really important words. The trick is to bear witness to this truth with humility, which is what we see in John the Baptist. You see, John is hugely successful. People flock to the Jordan to be baptized by him. And even the powerful know that John is around and to be reckoned with. And people are constantly trying to get him to say things about himself. Who are you? What do you say about yourself? And all of us have probably been in that situation, and we know what it's like. Who are you? You put a CV together, and I tell you what, if you've got your CV up to date, it looks pretty flash when you've done it, doesn't it? Nothing's held back to say how good we are because we're after a job. But for John, his purpose is not to blow his own trumpet, but to direct people away from himself and toward Jesus. And in fact, that is all our calling. To witness to Jesus, to point people to Jesus. And we need to remember and be encouraged by people like John and these 5 witnesses whose stories we've heard this morning. For they are just like us. And we are just like them. You see, in all the things that we do with our lives, in the positions we hold, the achievements we attain, the recognition a few of us might receive, for the most part, the most important part of our lives is that we are like John the Baptist. We point people to Jesus. You might become the Prime Minister of Australia. I might one day become the Pope. I don't know. They might get more ecumenical. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter in that sense. The biggest and most important part of our lives as followers of Jesus is to point to him. And you can be a teenager, as we saw. You can be a priest, an office worker, a street cleaner. You can come from Africa or Asia or the Pacific. You can be young, old, or in between. You can have been a Christian for 80 years or for 8 minutes. What is our purpose as followers of Jesus? To point people to him. Because in Jesus comes the Word of God. In him we find forgiveness, healing, new life. In him we find peace and hope, love and joy. In him we find our truest selves. In him we find our true home, which has always been in the heart of God. As we come to another Advent, it might be the first one for some and it might be the 80th for others, I don't know. But when we come to Advent again as we are, what does the gospel say to us about John the Baptist? What does the gospel say to us through John the Baptist? It is simply this: point people to Jesus. Because whoever it was that pointed us to Jesus, are we not eternally grateful? As we come today and we sit here, and maybe for a moment we recall the person or people who pointed us to Jesus, is that not the best thing that has ever happened to us? And why would we not want others to know what we have been blessed with? May that be the grace we share with the world around us this Christmas as we point them to Jesus. Amen.